What do Lethal Company, Skyrim, and Helldivers 2 all have in common? Well, they're designed to be broken.
Do you think the bridge can break?
Oh, I definitely think the bridge.
But what does that even mean? And why the heck would anyone deliberately design something to be broken? Well, it's because this method of design can result in chaotic emergence. And that can lead to some, shall we call it, unique gameplay?
Watch out for the thing. Watch out for the actual
Standing
thing.
on it. Oh,
Okay.
You have 2 seconds. 1.
You didn't even hit us.
By intentionally designing their games to have this chaotic emergence, the developers can create the opportunity for some wonderfully viral moments, and probably more importantly, deep replayability.
Oh yeah, they're fine. They'll just sit there.
Can I get off the turret? Are they just?
They're on our team now.
The real question though, and the one I know you're asking yourself, is how?
Stay right there.
Okay.
Mr. President,
Bye.
What methods or tools can we use to design for this chaotic emergence to then create games which accomplish this? First, let's understand what we mean when we talk about chaotic emergence. Typically, these are games that contain relatively simple systems which, when combined in unexpected ways, result in complex situations. That's a nice definition, but if you're anything like me, you grok things best using actual examples. So let's take a look at rocket jump and putting pots on heads. You probably know what rocket jump is, but if you don't, in the shooter game Unreal, if you shoot a rocket at your feet while jumping, your character will be accelerated and travel really far, really fast. But this wasn't intended. This occurs because of the way that games are sometimes made. Often objects in games are given properties. These properties are then used to inform what happens when that object interacts with another object. In the case of the rocket, it has properties such as damage, how fast it moves, the area of the explosion, and how much it pushes things when it explodes, or force. What created the rocket jump was how the player also has speed and weight on them. And when the force from the rocket affects the player, it affects their speed, pushing them across the map. Though fairly simple, the way that this is constructed, by assigning properties to objects and allowing them to be affected or affect each other, results in this unexpected result of players being able to use rockets to jump.
What are you doing that for?
Skyrim is a game which works in a very similar way to Unreal. Almost every item in Skyrim has properties on them, such as the pretty detailed physics states like weight that objects have that allow them to be picked up, moved, and thrown around. Unlike Unreal though, Skyrim also has dozens, if not hundreds, of very complex systems which players are able to interact with. One of those systems is theft, which allows players to steal items. Another system is how the characters that live in the world are aware of the player's actions that happen within their line of sight, a detection system, and the ability to determine a good action from a bad one. If an NPC detects the player stealing something by seeing them, the player is caught and labeled a criminal. When players spend some time playing the game, they discovered that if they put an object, such as a pot, on a character's head, then that character won't be able to see the player's actions. Players can now steal with impunity. This wasn't intentional design, but by approaching the design of the game in this way, the developers allow the player to break it. You can see how this kind of gameplay was likely never intended to occur by the developers of the game, yet the way they designed it unlocks this.
Need something.
Okay, so now we know what chaotic emergence is. How do we achieve that? What design methods can be used to create games that work like this? In God of War, players are given an axe. It's an awesome axe. Players are able to throw that axe to destroy enemies, slam it into the ground to create eruptions, and even pull it back to themselves using, I guess, like the Force. At very specific times in the game, players will come across chests that are locked. If players are able to aim and hit certain targets in a time allowed, they can unlock the chest and they're rewarded with some items. The players are given a puzzle with a very clear solution. Though these puzzles are fantastic and fun in their own way, the way that players solve this puzzle is the same for every player. Every player who plays the game who tries to solve the puzzle will have to solve it in the same way. Games which have chaotic emergence might have puzzles, but in most cases, those puzzles can be solved in a number of different ways. To do this takes kind of a unique mental model when designing the game. Designers need to think about building tools and simulations instead of puzzles and solutions. Rather than thinking of an axe that can be thrown in a very specific arc that affects only certain objects in specific ways when thrown, think about pots that can be placed on heads. To allow for chaotic emergence, design generous tools for the player that have many properties which can overlap with each other or with systems in the game, rather than designing bespoke tools to solve specific or limited problems. What does that even mean? Let's take a look at the drop pods in Helldivers. Their intended use is to bring a player back into the map after they've died. The developers could have created a simple game object that was mostly cosmetic, that covered the player's spawn. Instead, they created an object or a tool that has properties. These properties include speed, size, and how much damage it does on impact. These properties are then able to interact with other objects or systems in the game. They didn't intentionally rule out or restrict what can be damaged by the drop pod, only that it does damage. It's hard to say if that's deliberate. Some might think of it almost as lazy to not exclude these kind of interactions, but the result is an amount of player discovery. It may not have been intended for a drop pod to be used to kill bugs or destroy mission-critical buildings, but by approaching the design of objects in this way, this kind of organic interaction is possible. Create simulations that control the world rather than very specific, contained puzzles to solve. Did you know that in the stealth game Thief by Looking Glass, you could lean against the door and hear what was on the other side? That's a sound propagation system. It used the material of the door and the proximity of the player's head to determine the volume of a noise being made inside the room. In Helldivers, rather than place specific locations across the map that enemies can spawn in, there's a general system that spawns in enemies seemingly at random. In Lethal Company, every map is procedurally generated using a system that follows rules or guidelines to create it. All of these simulations are systems which allow players to interact with them in interesting ways and result in the sort of chaos that we're talking about here. How to go about designing these kinds of systems could honestly be a whole series of videos in and of themselves. But as a starting point, try to think about it as a series of rules that govern how the player will interact with the game. You can also parcel the systems up as much as possible without breaking the game or introducing too many bugs. The physics system, or like a gravity system of a game, is a good analogy here. Something to keep in mind with simulations, it can be taken too far. Honestly, to the point where you can focus way too much on the simulation over the game. A good example of this is Star Citizen. It has the potential to be an amazing game, but due to its overall complexity, it's unlikely to ever really be a good game. The more you break objects and systems up in this way, the more likely they are to result in this sort of emergence. For example, what if we had a grenade explosion with properties like damage, damage radius, how much light is emitted by the explosion, and the force created by that explosion? Pretty straightforward and common. The most obvious way for a player to use this would be throwing it at a bad guy and blowing them up, right? But what if all enemies had the ability to be light sensitive? Or what if there was like a day-night cycle system and the enemies that spawned in the night were way more likely to be impacted by this light sensitive value? And what if there was a system that randomized some of the ranges on the properties of the items, kind of like Diablo, such that there were some grenades that did a lot of light damage? Players would now be finding ways to try and collect grenades that have high light damage and then saving them for nighttime play to make those enemies easier. You can see how just a few simple components and simulation systems can cascade very quickly when layered together in this way. Do you remember what it was like to be a kid playing at the playground? Or I guess if you're old and grey like me, how your kids played when they were young? Give them just a few simple toys or even some sticks and rocks and a play space, and they could entertain themselves for a long time. Just like kids at a playground, games which have this sort of emergence treat their worlds like a play space where rules are meant to be broken. Skyrim is probably one of the best examples of such a playground. Though there's a fairly strong, potentially almost linear narrative that players can follow, it's also entirely possible for players to completely ignore this and begin stealing every possible item and killing every NPC that they encounter. Other games, like God of War for example, are extremely linear, and they're very strict rules about how the player can engage with it. Skyrim is kind of like, mum dropped the baby off at the sandpit and then went to play Clash of Clans on her phone for the next 20 minutes, while God of War is the parent who kind of hovers nearby, always scared of their kid finding a stick. Both are fine, but again, both are very different. Helldivers 2 and Lethal Company are a bit of a mix of both. Though they aren't nearly as strict as God of War, it's also not as free as Skyrim. The chaos in these games comes more from the way that the levels are procedurally generated, along with a limited number of general systems and loose rules that the players can interact with and break along the way. Skyrim has many, many more systems for the players to interact with, resulting in far more opportunities for the emergence to occur. It's worth noting that these playgrounds don't have to be procedural. Like Skyrim, they can be fixed, but some games benefit from that procedural nature as an affordance for fewer potential systems. However these playgrounds are generated, they have to be dynamic and allow the players to break them. Can you imagine a game of professional basketball? Extremely well-trained athletes, top of their game, all playing against each other with their careers on the line. Now imagine there wasn't a clear way to win. If it wasn't obvious whether teams won by scoring the most points or by bouncing the ball the most, or getting the most fouls or the least, or by yelling at the umpire the most, it would be utter chaos. And that's kind of exactly what we're trying to create here, right? Well, I mean, sort of. In any game, there does need to be some relatively clear way to win. It's just that there can be many ways to win, and sometimes winning can mean different things to different players. That's what we mean when we say success variability. It means that success is always possible, and to be possible, it needs to be clear. But how to get there, that can be very variable. Helldivers 2 is a great example of this. Every mission has a primary objective. To win, players need to complete that objective and then extract. Of course, how they achieve that is extremely variable. They may choose to go straight for it and do it first and then leave, or they may choose to do it last and try to collect every sample on the map. Lethal Company has great variability as well. Players may well earn everything that they need to satisfy the company in the first round, but more likely they're going to have a lot of ups and downs as they go. In addition to this, many players enjoy emergent games because the how they win hasn't really got anything to do with the way the designer intended them. Players may decide that they win by putting the most pots on heads. They accomplish this by having a very fixed, clear primary objective for players to accomplish. This gives the players a sense of comfort that they know how to complete the mission, and then throwing the player into the playground that they established. They also break that win state up into multiple sections. In Helldivers, players can complete bonus objectives. In Lethal Company, players can complete it over many days. By setting up a clear structure of conditions with a dynamic playground and a lot of optionality, players are in control of how they win. So to wrap it up, 3 methods to create a game that has chaotic emergence. Think about your game in terms of tools and systems rather than puzzles with solutions. The more you can break your game into objects with properties and systems that can be affected by those properties, the greater the potential for complex interactions. Establish your world less like a linear progression of missions and more like a dynamic playground. Be comfortable spreading obstacles across the playground and with being surprised with how players use the tools you give them to solve the obstacles. Leverage that dynamic playground by giving players clear win conditions and the freedom to decide how they'll accomplish it. If you enjoyed this video, which I really hope you did, I have another one just like it on how to make a game that's simple and complex like Thronefall. It's right here. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.